Hello again. This time I'd like to talk about Halloween, or rather the ancient origins of Halloween. As Halloween is celebrated in many parts of the world, on the night of the 31st of October and into the morning of the 1st of November, I'm sure many of those dressing up in fancy costumes, those going from door to door, trick or treating, dancing around bonfires and the like, would be surprised to know that they are celebrating something that dates back as far as 5,000 years ago, an ancient pre-Celtic fire festival called Samhain, one that symbolically divided the year into light and dark, the lighter one being summer and the darker one the winter, ending the harvest season and ushering in the winter. And in keeping with the ghostly, spooky aspect of Halloween today, at this time the division between the world of life and the world of death, the veil, I suppose we may call it, was thought to be at its thinnest, permitting spirits to pass through it. Ghosties, ghoulies, and lang-leggedy beasties, as the Scottish poet Robert Burns so eloquently put it. Now you may ask, and indeed you probably will, since it's a very obvious question, how? How do we know this festival is around 5,000 years old, since it's not actually mentioned in early Irish literature until the 9th century AD, though it was always seen even then as much older, considering the references to pagan things like open burial mounds, wandering spirits, and so forth. So, how can we date it? Well, now, that's a very good question, and there's an equally good answer, which always helps. We could give an approximate date for the age of Samhain from archaeology, thanks to the way many ancient sites here in Ireland were aligned with the sun on a particular date during the year, such as the very famous Newgrange Passage grave, where the rising sun shines down the entrance passage and illuminates the burial chamber on the winter solstice, or the cairns on Slieve na Chailleach, the mountain of the witch, that are aligned with the spring and autumn equinoxes. In particular are two hills in the Boyne Valley that were closely associated with this particular festival. One is the Hill of Ward, topped with an Iron Age ring fort, and the other the Hill of Tara, which was once the seat of the Ardrí na hÉireann, the High King of Ireland. The two hills are about 12 miles apart in the County Meath. The Hill of Ward was the location of the start of the Great Fire Festival in ancient times, and archaeologists have found very considerable indications of burning having taken place there, which establishes the fire aspect of the site. But on the Hill of Tara is a passage grave. It's known as the Mound of the Hostages. It is dated to between 4,500 and 5,000 years old, long before the first Celts actually arrived in Ireland around 2,500 years ago, and it is aligned with the rising sun at Samhain. Now, this would seem to show that the festival dates back as much as 5,000 years ago. Further evidence actually comes from Cairn El on Slieve na Chailleach, which I myself visited recently, which is dated to around 3,500 BC, and it is also aligned with Samhain. There's no other reason for these alignments on that particular date, so this is a very, very clear indication that a festival of some kind was taking place at that time. Samhain began at sunset on the 31st of October, and it ended at sunset on the 1st of November, because in those ancient times a day was regarded as going from one sunset to the next sunset. And it was one of four great festivals that occurred each year in Ireland long ago, and in some other Celtic regions as well, such as Scotland and the Isle of Man. And they were Samhain on the 1st of November, Imbolc on the 1st of February, Beltane on the 1st of May, and Lunasa on the 1st of August. All at least 2,000 years old from what documentation of them survives, though given the age of Samhain, we may assume that they too are actually much older, probably all of them of a very similar age. Now, in practice, it seems they were not always celebrated on the 1st of the month. They could be celebrated on another day for various reasons, on the first Sunday of the month in later times, for example. But the 1st of the month, that's the official date for the four great festivals. Fires will be extinguished across Ireland. All fires, fires in the hearth, forge fires, fires were extinguished. And then they would be relighted from the great fire kindled by the Ardrí's chief druid on the hill of Ward, and from regional fires in the realms of various local kings. And there were kings all over the place in Ireland in those times. You could hardly throw a stone in any direction without hitting a king of some kind, with people lighting torches or carrying containers of burning material back to their homes or workplaces to rekindle their own household fires, the fires in their forges, and so forth. And public fires, of course, were lit on high places. There would be various celebrations as well, the ritual mourning for the death of summer, of course, but horse races, markets, fairs, fortune telling, and all that sort of thing. But despite all the celebrations, there was also an element of fear associated with this time of year. Oh, yes, quite a lot of superstitious fear, since, they had superstitions about everything. This was a society deeply rooted with a whole host of superstitions, and Samhain was a very good example of that, since it was believed that the veil between our world and the world of the dead was very thin at this time, easily penetrated, so that the spirits of the dead, as well as various entities, malevolent forces, and fairies, could move freely between the two. For that reason, the Druids saw it as the best time to foretell the future, using the ability to contact the more readily available spirits, which made perfect sense from their point of view. Offerings would be made to the spirits and to the fairies, since in ancient times, fairies were not seen as particularly friendly. They were not lovely little things with pretty wings fluttering around at the bottom of your garden. Oh, no, not by a long way. And care had to be taken not to upset them, as well as guarding against them should they come as the fairy host, seen as airborne spirits of the restless dead, who might even be on the hunt for people to steal away back to their own world. You couldn't have that sort of thing going on. Now, the fairies could be very helpful and beneficial to humans, if treated with respect. But if disrespected, they could also react with anger and cruelty. So, you have to tread lightly around fairies. So people would burn crops and animals as sacrifices to the spirits, as well as various deities. And they would wear costumes, things like animal heads or skins, partly to visit the homes of people, pretending sometimes to be the spirits of the dead or the fairies themselves, and getting offerings. That was sort of the fun side of it. But this had another use. You see, dressing up like spirits was also seen as a protection from the genuine spirits, especially the fairy host, who would mistake them for actual spirits like themselves and ignore them, which really didn't say much for the spirit's powers of observation, but who am I to question the wisdom of the ancients? The fires that were lit, of course, offered some protection from spirits as well, and turnips would be carved with faces, and these would be used to scare the spirits away, which in later times, of course, became the pumpkins that are such a feature of Halloween today. Given the supposed thinness of the veil, departed family members would be invited to dine, in spirit at least. I'm not really sure how they were actually going to eat solid food, but anyway, we won't go into that. And extra places would be set for them at the table. Other spirits would also be welcomed, and they'd be offered food and drink, which would usually be left outside for passing spirits to partake of. Always good to have friendly spirits on your side. Oh, yes. They never actually ate or drank any of it, though no doubt the offerings left outside were partaken of by passing animals. And, sad to say, despite the well-meant invitations, the departed ancestors never actually turned up. And I'm sure the diners would have vacated the premises very rapidly if they had. But it was the thought. It was the thought that counted. Another tradition was that a quantity of straw would have been left in the fields after the harvest was gathered, ready for Samhain, and that would have been for the puka, which was a shape-shifting creature that could take many forms, animal and human, though usually it appeared as a dark, normally black, sleek horse with luminescent golden eyes and a long flowing mane and tail. Samhain was known as the Puka Day, and a puka finding no straw left for it on its own day of all days, well, it would have been severely offended, and nobody wanted that. Oh, dear me, no. The puka could be, well, shall we say, mischievous at times. It could damage things, scare animals, and generally make a bit of a nuisance of itself. Even today, in some places in Ireland, reapers will leave a small bit of the harvest crop untouched in the field, that being seen as the puka's share. Better safe than sorry, I always say. Many great events in ancient Celtic folklore occurred at this time. Legends grew up around it, such as the epic battle between the Tuatha De Danann and the evil Fomorians, and how Finn MacCool defeated Eileen the Burner when that gentleman came to burn the hill of Tara, which for him had become rather an annual event. He was said to play the harp and to sing beautiful songs which could lull people to sleep, and he would burn all the buildings on the hill of Tara to ashes every year at Samhain, using his fiery breath, they being wood and straw buildings, of course, at that time. And he would do that after he had first lulled the inhabitants to sleep with his magically beautiful music. Now, I'm not sure why he did that or why he did it at Samhain, but he did. That's all that mattered. But Finn MacCool, well, he'd had enough of that. So one Samhain, he inhaled the poison from his spear. Woo. And its effect kept him awake. It made him immune to Eileen's music. And he slew the evil pyromaniac harpist. So that was the end of him. By so doing, not only did he stop the Ard Rí having to rebuild Tara every year. I mean, think of it. The insurance premiums must have been astronomical, like 10,000 cattle and 5,000 sheep or something. But his valiant firefighting actions won him the leadership of the great warrior band known as the Fianna. Good for him. Then Christianity arrived, and the various pagan festivals began to decline as conversion to the new faith from distant Palestine increased. But the churches initially didn't try to stamp out pagan beliefs as such. Instead, they used pagan connections to help with that conversion, baptizing people with water from the former pagan sacred wells, for example, or building churches in or near sacred groves, thus making a connection with the former beliefs that assisted conversion, even adapting the great Celtic triple goddess Bridget to that end, giving her a single identity, popping a halo on her head and calling her Saint Bridget, her new feast day simply being her old pagan day of worship, and many of her old symbols were retained, such as an everlasting fire that had been tended by female druids and was now tended by nuns. The Church in Ireland discovered psychology centuries before Sigmund Freud came along. In the year 601 AD, Pope Gregory I sent a man named Mellitus to England, appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury and the first Bishop of London. But the new bishop found resistance from the pagans of London. They didn't really think very much of their new bishop, and his conversion efforts were not progressing smoothly by a long way. So the Pope wrote to him, and we know about this because the letter was preserved by the Venerable Bede, in which Gregory suggested that conversion of the pagans should be undertaken gradually, slowly and carefully. Don't beat them over the head with it. Try to encourage them. And to give it a helping hand, he suggested that pagan rituals and customs should be adapted to serve as Christian ones. Things that had been pagan and thus very bad would become Christian and thus very good, even if they were exactly the same as they had been before. I'm sure he was well aware that such was already being done in some places, such as Ireland, where bathing in the waters of a pagan sacred well would have been decidedly evil. But naming the well after a saint and pouring its water over somebody's head, well, that would be good and holy, despite the water being the same water it had always been. Anyway, observances honouring the dead began to coincide with the pagan Samhain in various places, and the date was officially set in the 8th century, when Pope Gregory III dedicated a chapel in Rome's St. Peter's Basilica in honour of all the saints, both those officially canonized and those unknown, All Saints' Day, and he did it on November the 1st. All Saints' Day, or All Souls' Day, was also known as All Hallows' Day, the Feast of All Saints, the Feast of All Hallows, the Solemnity of All Saints, the commemoration of all the faithful departed, the Day of the Dead, and Hallowmass. Now, to begin with, this is purely a local tradition limited to Rome, but in 837 AD, Pope Gregory IV ordered the observance of All Saints' Day on November the 1st for the entire Christian Church. Now, this is where our modern Halloween came about, from All Hallows, a phrase that was found in Old English, but the term All Hallows' Eve is not recorded until 1556. In Old English, hallowed meant something holy, something sanctified, something really good, and All Hallows, or All Saints' Day, was celebrated the night before, All Hallows' Eve, being an evening of fasting and prayer, everyone preparing for the following feast day. Gradually, over time, Hallows' Eve became Hallowen and later Halloween, meaning simply the evening before Hallows. As time went on, All Souls' Day began to be celebrated in a very similar way to Samhain, with bonfires and people dressing up in costumes, often trying to look like saints, angels, or devils. The old pagan celebrations began to seep back into it, you might say, though with the trappings of Christianity added, those dressing up to resemble saints rather than the spirits of the dead, for example. The term trick-or-treat is very recent. It was first used in 1927. But the idea of going from house to house to obtain gifts of some kind is an old one, at least as far back as the 15th century, and probably much earlier, when poor people would dress up in costumes and they would go to the houses of wealthy families and be given little pastries called soul cakes, in exchange for which the recipients would pray for the souls of the homeowner's departed relatives, which was known as souling. And the practice was later taken up particularly by children who would go from door to door asking for gifts, such as food, money, and ale. Yes, ale. Well, this was the Middle Ages, after all. There's an English souling rhyme from that time, which the soulers would chant as they went around, which goes, a soul cake, have mercy on all Christian souls for a soul cake. They must have been good, all that praying one had to do in order to get one. Souling was also known as guising, from disguising. And of course the idea of putting on costumes of some kind and going around looking for gifts dated right back to the old pagan traditions of Samhain, as do our modern bonfires and the carving of things to scare away spirits, only the pumpkin has replaced the humble turnip for that purpose. The bonfires lit at Halloween are, of course, a link to the ancient fire rituals of Celtic times. Though we no longer make sacrifices by fire, we don't chuck produce or small animals into the fire, much to the relief of small animals, I'm sure. Though, the fires are a great way of getting rid of old furniture or other combustible things you don't want. I've made use of that quite a few times myself. I mean, why pay some waste collection service when all you have to do is just sort of, happen to leave it outside when children are going around collecting things for the local bonfire. Works every time. So there we have the history of Samhain, one of the great festivals of ancient Ireland that has lasted down to our own time, albeit in a drastically altered form, but still a living link with the past. So, while you put on your Halloween costume, take the kids out to annoy the neighbours and hopefully return with a bucket full of goodies, before jumping around a bonfire, assuming, of course, somebody hasn't called the fire brigade about it and now it's just a soggy pile of charred mush, just remember your connection with the traditions of ancient Ireland. When the chief druid kindled that mighty fire on the hill of Ward, and everyone said, "Will you hurry up and get the fire lit? Sure, it's bloody freezing in here." Yes, well, with that, I shall say goodbye until next time. Goodbye for now.